All right, so you're here because you love to learn, you want to understand these fascinating topics, but who has time to read all those books, right? So that's where we come in. Today we're going deep into a school of thought from ancient India. You ready for this? It's called Charvaka.
Ooh, Charvaka. Now there's a name you don't hear every day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to challenge some of our preconceived notions about what ancient Indian philosophy is all about. I mean, when we think about it, we often jump to spirituality, like deep metaphysics, the soul, that kind of thing.
Right, the mystical side of things.
Exactly. But Charvaka, well, they were all about materialism, skeptical of all those traditional religious and metaphysical ideas.
Yeah, Charvaka was a real outlier in a lot of ways. I mean, think about it. Here's a philosophy emerging in ancient India, a place where spirituality is often seen as like the defining characteristic, and they're saying, nope, it's all about the material world. It's a really captivating example of how diverse and vibrant Indian thought really was.
So, materialism, just to be clear, are we saying they believe that the physical world is like the only reality?
Yeah, that's the foundation of their whole system. That's all there is, the stuff we can see and touch. And that skepticism you mentioned, it extended to like all the core religious concepts, the afterlife, the soul, karma, the whole shebang.
Now, here's the tricky part. Finding original Charvaka texts is a real challenge. It's almost like they vanished into thin air.
It's true. We're basically historical detectives here. Like, we're trying to piece together their philosophy from the arguments made against it by other schools of thought.
It's like trying to understand a conversation by only hearing one side of it.
Exactly. You have to read between the lines, try to figure out, okay, what were they arguing against? What were the Charvaka ideas that provoked these responses? It's a fascinating intellectual puzzle.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive, right? We're going to sift through these ancient debates, see if we can reconstruct those core ideas of Charvaka, figure out where it came from, and of course, why it matters. Sound good?
Absolutely. And despite the lack of original texts, history gives us, these little glimpses into their world. Like, we find hints of Charvaka popping up in some pretty unexpected places.
So give us a sense of the timeline here. When did this Charvaka way of thinking first emerge? And was it like a flash in the pan, or did it stick around and have a real impact?
Well, scholars generally place the emergence of Charvaka around 2,500 years ago. Pretty old, right? But some scholars like Garbe, he suggested that there might have been materialistic thinkers in India even before Gautama Buddha.
Whoa, so that's going way back.
Yeah, really far back. And there's even a view that suggests their roots could go back as far as the Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in Hinduism.
Wow, so these ideas have been around for a long time. But were they, like, just fringe beliefs held by a few people, or did they actually make some noise, even if it was negative attention?
Oh, they definitely got people talking. We see mentions of Charvaka in all sorts of important ancient texts. Take the Upanishads, for example, some of the most foundational Hindu texts. We see what seem like Charvaka ideas being addressed in the Katha Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Ishvadhashvatara Upanishad, the Maitri Upanishad, and even the Chandogya Upanishad. They pop up all over the place.
Wow, so they were clearly on the radar of the mainstream thinkers. Can you give us some specific examples of what these Charvaka folks were saying that was causing such a stir?
Well, for example, in the Katha Upanishad, there's this mention of people who, they're so caught up in wealth and worldly pleasures that they lack faith in any kind of afterlife. They believe this world is all there is, and they fall prey to death again and again. It's almost like a direct critique of the Charvaka worldview.
Makes sense, right? That whole focus on the here and now.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there's this statement that suggests consciousness arises from the elements and then just dissolves back into them at death. It implies there's no soul that continues on, no baby birth. And then you've got the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which talks about the universe originating from a combination of elements. These all sound like Charvaka ideas being addressed, right?
It's like they're laying out the Charvaka position just to knock it down.
Exactly. And perhaps the most telling example is the Maitri Upanishad. It explicitly calls Brihaspati a figure closely linked to Charvaka, a heretical teacher. I mean, that label alone tells you a lot about how the mainstream viewed these ideas.
Heretical teacher, that's a pretty serious charge. And this Brihaspati guy keeps coming up. We'll have to dig into him a bit later. But what about other ancient texts? Do we see these materialist ideas popping up elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. Even the epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata mention them. In the Aranyakanda, the Ramayana, there's this whole story about someone advising Rama, the hero of the story, to abandon his faith in karma. And in the Mahabharata, which is full of these different philosophical debates, there's strong pushback against those who didn't accept the authority of the Vedas. They even explicitly mention the Lokayata sect, which is another name for Charvaka. And you even see followers of Kapila, a famous sage, refuting Gnostica views, which likely included those of the Charvakas.
Gnostica, that's a term we should probably unpack a little bit for our listeners. But before we do, I'm curious, Were these materialists just seen as, like, intellectual rivals, or was the reaction more intense than that?
Oh, the reaction was definitely pretty intense. The Mahabharata calls those who go against the Vedas great Gnostikas, and later texts like the Srimad Bhagavad Gita even mention something called Swabhavavada, which basically means naturalism. And commentators like the famous Shankaracharya saw that as a reference to the Lokayata, likely presented as a kind of straw man argument to be refuted.
It's amazing how these ideas, even if presented negatively, echo across so many different texts. You mentioned earlier a text that might actually be a more direct expression of Charvaka thought.
Right, the Tapo Paplavasima. It was written by a guy named Jayarashipata sometime in the 7th century CE. A lot of scholars believe this is one of the few surviving texts that actually aligns with Charvaka philosophy.
So we're finally getting a glimpse into their world directly, rather than through their opponents.
It does feel that way. And Hatha, he goes all in on critiquing those foundational concepts like the afterlife and the soul. But get this, he even questions the validity of pramanas.
Pramanas. Remind us what those are again?
Yeah, good point. Pramanas are basically the accepted sources of knowledge in Indian philosophy, things like direct perception, inference, and testimony. Pata was skeptical of all of them.
Whoa, they doubted even direct perception. That's next-level skeptical.
Right? He argued that, like, worldly affairs go on just fine without us needing all this fancy philosophical reasoning. The everyday world, in his view, works independently of these intellectual constructs.
Talk about cutting through the noise and getting back to basics. So it sounds like Charvaka really wanted to ground everything in what we can observe and experience in the material world. Now, jumping forward in time a bit, I understand there's been some renewed scholarly interest in Charvaka.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Professor Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay's work in English was huge in bringing attention back to Indian materialistic philosophies. He argued that they deserve their rightful place in the history of Indian thought. But, there's always some debate in academia. Some critics have pointed out that his interpretations sometimes lean towards a more socialistic reading.
So a bit of controversy there, but nonetheless, he helped bring these ideas back into the spotlight. All right, so we've established that Charvaka existed, it was debated, and people are still studying it today. But now let's get to the heart of it. What were the fundamental principles of their philosophy? What did they actually believe to be true about the world and how it works?
Okay, so the cornerstone, the most foundational aspect, is their materialism, or you could also call it physicalism. And this is really important to understand because while Indian philosophy is often known for its spiritual side, right, Charvaka is a totally materialistic system. It's kind of a mistake to think that all Indian thought is spiritual.
Like they're saying, hold on, there's another side to this story.
Exactly. And what did they consider to be the primary reality, the basis of everything? Well, for them, it was nature, the physical world. They saw it as without beginning, without end.
Eternal and self-existent.
Right. And its fundamental attributes were things like motion, change, transformation, form, color, shape, weight, temperature, attraction, repulsion, all the tangible aspects of the world that we can experience.
So the stuff we bump into every day. But what about consciousness? How did they explain something as complex as consciousness if they were so strictly focused on the physical world?
That's a great question. And this is where things get really interesting. They believed that consciousness, and by that I mean like life, sentience, feeling, intellect, mind, thought, all of it arises at a certain stage in the development of matter.
So not something separate, but like a product of matter.
Yeah, exactly. And to explain it, they often use this really cool analogy. Think about the color red. You can create the color red by combining ingredients that themselves aren't red. Like you can take a betel leaf, some lime, catechu, and areca nut, mix them together, and you get this vibrant red color. Consciousness, they argue, is similar. It emerges from a specific combination of material elements. The combination creates something new that wasn't there in the individual parts. It's a really profound insight, and it directly contradicts those philosophies that see consciousness or the soul as pre-existing or eternal.
It's like a chemical reaction almost. Combine the right ingredients and boom, you get consciousness.
Exactly. It's an emergent property. And they took this idea even further, arguing that the unconscious universe has always existed. It's primary. It doesn't rely on any kind of mind or imagination for its being.
That also kind of neatly sidesteps the whole creation question, doesn't it? If the material world is eternal and self-sufficient, you don't need a creator God or any supernatural explanations.
Exactly. The question of where did everything come from just doesn't arise in their system. No need for creation myths or mystical explanations.
It's refreshingly straightforward in a way. So how did they believe we acquire knowledge about this material world? What did they consider to be a reliable way of knowing things?
Well, they were all about sensory perception, what we can experience directly through our senses, the indriyas. That was the only valid way of knowing, according to them. They argued that knowledge derived from our senses has this, like, universal basis. It's the same for everyone, right? You see a tree, I see a tree, we both agree it's a tree, there's no room for doubt.
It's hard to argue with that.
Right, and this directly connects back to their understanding of consciousness. They argued that thought arises from the material world, from our interactions with it. It's the opposite of those spiritualistic philosophies that say consciousness is primary and the material world comes from it. For the Charvakas, it's the other way around. Matter comes first, and then consciousness arises from it.
So the physical world shapes our thoughts, not the other way around. This definitely puts them outside the mainstream, right? Earlier, you mentioned they were considered Gnostica. Can you explain what that means, especially in the context of ancient Indian philosophy?
Yeah, Gnostica is a really interesting term. It's often translated as atheist, but it's actually broader than that. In the context of Indian philosophy, it usually refers to those schools of thought that didn't accept the authority of the Vedas, the ancient scriptures. So Charvaka's rejection of the Vedas automatically put them in that Gnostica camp.
So it's not just about believing or not believing in God, but about the source of authority.
Right. And, the term Gnostica also has a more general meaning. It refers to a kind of skeptical attitude towards those prevailing religious rules and rituals, especially when people are just going through the motions and they've lost touch with the real meaning. In a way, that kind of skepticism can be seen as a search for the true spirit of religion. Like, what's the point of all this if we're not really connecting with something deeper?
Yeah, it's like questioning the status quo, trying to get to the heart of things.
Exactly. And think about it. The emergence of Buddha and Mahavira, they also challenged the established norms, and they were considered Gnostikas by some. It was a time of real intellectual ferment, with people questioning those long-held beliefs.
So Charvaka wasn't alone with this kind of skeptical approach, but they took it pretty far with their rejection of core Vedic ideas.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Traditionally, to be considered an Astika, orthodox school in Indian philosophy, you had to accept certain things, like the belief in rebirth, the existence of God, the afterlife, and maybe most importantly, the authority of the Vedas, both the Shruti, the revealed texts, and the Smriti, the traditions. Gnostica schools rejected one or more of these.
So Charvaka's denial of the afterlife and their rejection of Vedic authority firmly placed them in the Gnostica category. But you mentioned earlier that some schools were kind of in a gray area when it came to this classification.
Yeah, it wasn't always black and white. Some schools, like Mimamsa, they accepted the Vedas as the ultimate authority, but they were atheistic. They didn't believe in a creator god. And then you've got schools like Samkhya, Jainism, and Buddhism. They all believed in rebirth, but not necessarily in a personal god. So it really depends on which criteria you're using. Some schools could be considered both Astika and Gnostica, depending on how you look at it.
It's a good reminder that these categories aren't always as rigid as we might think. And, it makes you wonder if those Gnostica schools, by challenging those orthodox views, actually helped the Astika schools refine their own arguments and strengthen their positions. Like they had to up their game to respond to these critiques.
That's a really interesting point. It's like iron sharpens iron. The back and forth between different schools of thought definitely enriched the intellectual landscape. Okay, so we've talked about the Gnostica label, but now let's get back to the name Charvaka itself. What does it actually mean? Does the name give us any clues about their philosophy or how they were perceived?
Yeah, it's a pretty unique name.
It is. The most common interpretation is that it comes from Charufak, which translates to beautiful speech or attractive speech. It kind of suggests someone who is eloquent, persuasive, maybe even charming in their arguments.
So they were known for their smooth talk.
Maybe, yeah. But there are also some less flattering interpretations, which, probably came from their opponents. Some people said it meant one who chews his own words, implying they were inconsistent or contradicted themselves. And there's even one that means one who swallows sin and merit, suggesting they didn't care about traditional ethics.
So the name itself becomes a battleground.
Exactly. And adding to the intrigue, there's a mention of a guy named Charvaka in a dialogue with Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata. So some scholars think there might have actually been a historical figure named Charvaka who either founded the school or, was a key figure in developing its ideas. Others think Charvaka might have been the name of a disciple who first learned the teachings from a guy named Brihaspati, who we'll talk more about later, around the 6th century BCE. This is also what Metsamor believes, according to our source.
So it's a bit of a mystery. Was it a name, a title, both? But you also mentioned another name associated with this school, Lokayata. What does that one tell us?
Lokayata is a really interesting name. It comes from loka, which means world, specifically the material world, and ayata, which can mean drawn towards, based on, or prevalent in. So Lokayata basically translates to something like rooted in the material world or prevalent among the people. It really emphasizes that focus on the tangible, the here and now. And it's worth noting that even Kautilya, in his famous Arthashastra, which is like a political treatise, he includes Lokayata as a valid school of thought within Anvikshiki, which is the philosophy of inquiry. He puts it right alongside Sankhya and Yoga, which shows that it was a recognized system of thought.
Yeah, so it wasn't just some fringe movement. It was taken seriously by some pretty important thinkers.
Absolutely. And there's even a modern scholar, Dakshinarajan Shastri, in his book Charvaka Darshan. He basically calls for a re-examination of Charvaka principles. He says all intelligent scholars should take a fresh look at their ideas.
So their ideas are still relevant today, even after all these centuries.
It seems so. And remember those Lokaya Tatikas we talked about? They were also known as Haitukas, which means logicians. And as we mentioned before, they were super skeptical, even questioning those pramanas, the sources of knowledge. Some people see them as representing a kind of pure agnosticism when it comes to knowing anything for sure.
So both names, Charvaka and Lokayata, point to a school of thought that was grounded in the material world and relied on logic and critical thinking. Now, we've mentioned Brihaspati a few times already. What's his connection to this whole Charvaka-Lokayata thing? Why is he so important?
Well, Brihaspati is traditionally considered the kind of the father of Lokayata philosophy. Now, most of his original writings are lost, but later texts mention these 12 sutras, which are like aphorisms attributed to him. They lay out the key principles of materialist thought. And these sutras are quoted and discussed by later scholars like Kamalashila, Jayantabhatta, and Gunaratna, usually as a starting point for their refutations of materialism. So Brihaspati is seen as the originator of this tradition.
So even though we don't have his original work, his ideas are still echoing through these later texts.
Exactly. And Madhvacharya, in his book Sarvadashana Samgraha, which is basically a survey of different Indian philosophical systems, he calls the Charvaka followers of Brihaspati the crest jewel of Gnostics. It's a pretty dramatic way of saying they were like the most extreme example of those who rejected Vedic authority.
So a bit of a backhanded compliment there.
You could say that. And there's also a belief that Brihaspati might have written a whole metrical work, and some verses from it are quoted in the Sarvadashana Sangraha. This was supported by Dr. Dasgupta, according to our source.
So we might have some fragments of his actual words out there somewhere.
Yeah, maybe. It's like finding these little pieces of a lost puzzle. And there was another scholar, Pandit Baldev Upadhyay. He tried to establish that Brihaspati was a real historical figure. He pointed to examples in commentaries by Shankara, Bhaskaracharya, and even commentaries on the Gita to support his argument. But as our source points out, figuring out exactly which Brihaspati is being referred to can be tricky because there were several ancient figures with that name. And, this kind of highlights a tendency in ancient Indian thought to focus on the ideas themselves rather than on the individual who said them. It was more about the teachings than the teacher.
It's like they're saying the ideas are what matter, not who came up with them.
Exactly. And adding another layer to this whole Brihaspati mystery, there's a play called Prabodha Tandurbaya. It's an allegorical Sanskrit play, and it suggests that Vachaskati, who might be another name for Brihaspati, created a whole tantra, like a treatise, dedicated to Charvaka's teachings. And the play says that this was then expanded upon by Charvaka and his disciples.
So it's like a game of telephone where the message gets passed down and maybe modified along the way. But even with all these layers of interpretation and potential distortion, we do have some sense of the core tenets of Brihaspati's philosophy, right?
Yes, absolutely. By piecing together those sutras attributed to Brihaspati and the summaries and quotes found in the works of his opponents, we can get a pretty good picture of what he taught.
Okay, so let's get into it. What were the key beliefs that made up this Brihaspati-Charvaka worldview?
Okay, so first, they believed there were only 4 elements that make up reality: earth, water, fire, and air. They didn't accept the idea of a 5th element, ether or akasha, which a lot of other Indian philosophies believed in. Second, they said the human body, with all its senses, is just a combination of these 4 elements. And third, this is a big one, they said that consciousness arises from a specific combination of these elements. Remember that analogy with the red color? It's the same idea.
So no soul, no separate spiritual essence.
Nope. The 4th key idea is that the conscious, living body is the soul. 5th, to explain life and death, they use this really simple analogy. They said it's like bubbles in water. Bubbles form spontaneously, then they burst. Life, they said, is the same. It arises from the elements and then ceases to exist when the elements dissolve. No need for an external cause or a soul that transvibrates.
So death is the end of the line.
That's right. 6, they completely deny the afterlife. No heaven, no hell, no realms beyond this material world. 7th, they said all that talk about heavenly bliss and spiritual rewards, it's just the babbling of priests who are trying to control people. 8th, and this is where they really break from tradition, they said that artha, which is material wealth, and tama, which is sensual pleasure, these are the primary goals of life. They challenge that traditional emphasis on dharma, righteousness, and moksha, liberation.
It's like they're turning the whole value system upside down.
Yeah, kind of. And 9th, they considered politics to be the only true science. This might be because they were so focused on practical, worldly matters like how to govern and run a society. 10th, they said direct sensory perception is the only valid way of knowing. And lastly, they said that the way most people live their lives, that's actually the most reasonable and desirable path.
So no need for complicated rituals or ascetic practices.
Not according to them. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these teachings were often presented as a kind of like a foil. Other schools would lay out the Charvaka position just to knock it down. In fact, Charvaka is probably one of the most criticized schools of thought in the whole history of Indian philosophy.
And our source mentioned that some of that criticism was pretty harsh. They didn't hold back.
No, they didn't. The Lokayatadikos were known for being pretty outspoken, and they would level some serious accusations against those who disagreed with them. They'd call Sadhus and Sannyasis cheats and deceivers. They'd say Brahmins were witless and impotent, and they'd accuse Vedantists of being lazy. It was pretty intense.
So there's some real animosity there. But within the Charvaka school itself, were there different interpretations of these core ideas, like different factions?
Yeah, good question. Jantapatha, in his book Nyamanjari, he distinguishes between two main types of Charvaka. The Dirta Charvaka, which basically means uncultured or crude Charvaka, and the Sushikshita Charvaka, which means cultured or refined Charvaka. So even when materialism, there were different levels of like how far you took those ideas.
So what were the main differences between these two branches?
Well, their views on the soul differed. The Dirta Charvaka had a more radical view. They said the soul is just a bunch of elements, and when the body dies, the soul dies too. The Sushikshita Charvaka, they were still materialists, but they said there's a soul that's distinct from the body, a conscious entity that experiences things. But they also said it's mortal and it dies with the body. And there were other variations too. Some Charvakas identified the soul with the breath or the senses or the mind. So even within this one school of thought, there was room for debate and nuance.
Makes sense. So given that they were so focused on the material world and the pursuit of pleasure, what did their ethics look like? How did they decide what was right and wrong?
Well, Charvaka ethics are generally considered to be hedonistic, meaning pleasure, sukha, is the ultimate goal. Interestingly, they considered the absence of both pleasure and pain to be a state of sukha. But how they understood pleasure differed between those two branches we talked about.
So eat, drink, and be merry for the Durta Charvakas.
Yeah, pretty much. They were all about immediate gratification, but the Sushikshita Charvaka, they took a more nuanced approach. They still believed pleasure was the goal, but they also emphasized self-control and a disciplined life. They recognized that too much indulgence can actually lead to unhappiness in the long run.
So it's not just about instant gratification, but about finding lasting pleasure through a more balanced approach.
Right, and it's interesting to note that even Vatsyayana, the author of the Kama Sutra, he acknowledged the importance of pleasure, but he also said that dharma, or righteousness, is the highest goal. He said pleasure should be pursued in a way that doesn't violate ethical principles. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna actually says, I am Kama, which is not contrary to dharma, suggesting that even within traditions that valued pleasure, there was an understanding that it had to be balanced with other values.
So even the Charvakas, with their emphasis on pleasure, couldn't completely escape the ethical considerations that were so central to Indian thought. It seems like a very human struggle, trying to find that balance between pleasure and responsibility.
It really is a universal theme. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners about this fascinating and often misunderstood school of thought?
Well, I think the most important things to remember are that Charvaka was radically materialist. They believed the physical world is all there is. They rejected all those supernatural concepts. They emphasized direct experience is the only reliable way of knowing things. And they were very critical of those established religious traditions and the authority of the Vedas.
That's a great summary, and it's worth remembering that even though our understanding of Charvaka is pieced together from fragments and criticisms, they represent a really important counterpoint to the dominant spiritual trends in Indian thought. They remind us that there were always alternative ways of looking at the world.
Absolutely. And hopefully our listeners now have a clearer, more nuanced understanding of this complex and fascinating school of thought. That's what we're all about here, right? Efficient knowledge acquisition.
That's the goal.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. The Charvakas were grappling with some pretty big questions. What is consciousness? How do we know anything for sure? What's the purpose of life? And these are questions we're still asking today, right? So I want you to imagine a Charvaka thinker, someone committed to materialism and empirical observation, being transported to our modern world. What would they make of our society? What would they think about our own forms of dogma, our beliefs in science, technology, progress? It's something to think about. And until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions.
That's it. Keep learning.